All right, let's kick it off and let everybody keep filing in as we go. All right, can we go to the first slide? All right, I'll introduce you to Airiam, and Rob here will introduce you to Semper Sec, but then we're going to go through some of the regulatory compliances that, defense contractors and some contractors will have to deal with, and then discuss some of the upcoming things and what the next steps are. Next slide. All right, I'm Art O'Kane, handling CISO and CIO at Airiam, and this is Rob Carson, founder and CEO at Semper Sec. Amazing guy, even though he got some Marine blood in him.
Can't all be perfect.
All right, would you like to introduce Semper Sec, Rob?
Absolutely. So Semper Sec, it's what we do, what I lovingly call the arts and crafts of cybersecurity. So where we come in is when you're trying to meet compliance frameworks, trying to overall implement a security program that functions off a set of standards. That's what we do. So we come in, we craft policies, facilitate your risk assessment, do your internal audit, sit there as your battle buddy during certification, and what we're good at, especially, is when it's managing multiple frameworks. So if you've got to do, you do B2B, so you've got SOC 2, ISO, and then you've also got maybe some HIPAA and, maybe PCI. And then you've also got the federal side. You got NIST, 800-171, maybe FedRAMP. That's what we do. So it's not the sexy side of, it is the sexy side of cyber, but we don't hack Teslas.
And one thing that Rob always says, and I agree with, is he makes it suck less. He actually makes this experience okay to go through on this audit prep and having that audit buddy.
Imagine a world where someone goes, "This is what you need to worry about. Do this, do that," and kind of streamlines the world.
Absolutely. All right, next slide.
And real quick, our mission is to make it suck less, right? As Art said, that's our goal is to make sure it aligns with the business, and you're hitting yours, because a lot of times you're doing if you're working with us, you generally have a sales goal. Someone is inhibited from selling something because you need to be a certain compliance standard to pass a test, and that's where we come in to make sure that you're able to grow and scale.
Great. Let me introduce Airiam. Airiam really came from several companies coming together. MSPs, MSSPs, software companies, and digital transformation companies. One of them is even our own XDR platform that has been folded in. And really the concept is to be the best IT and cybersecurity company out there. And we're accomplishing that well, and we're continuing to grow. Our three real ambitions or missions are to offer the best IT management products and services, to build the best in class cybersecurity platform, and to create more value for businesses through resilience. We consider ourselves a resilience company because of that union of IT and cybersecurity. It just positions us in a place to be able to keep customers running and get them back up and running if there is any kind of incident. We've been in the press a lot. We have an IR team that handles ransomware incidents, so we get a lot of attention because of that. We also have offices around the United States. Main offices are in Houston, Milwaukee, Pennsylvania, and in Maryland, we have 2 offices in the DC area and on the Eastern Shore. All right, Rob, you want to talk us through what 800-171 is?
Absolutely. So NIST 800-171 is basically it's a subset of 853. The idea behind it is it's tailored for companies that are interacting with data that is not classified, but if you start to combine the things, it becomes of a higher value. So they call it basically for controlled unclassified information. You'll also hear the term CMMC. And CMMC is basically 800-171 with some monitoring, things like that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But Airiam 171, it's 853 light, if you will.
Awesome.
And who needs it, right? So this is where there's a lot of confusion out there. So CMMC has not been officially approved and mandated, but if you are selling to the DoD, you are generally filling out what's called a SPRS. You're filling out a form that's attesting to your compliance to 800-171. So anyone that's selling to the DoD, has DoD contracts, you're gonna fall into that category or a flow down. So there are some updates, and we're not going to get into detail about the specific updates, because at the end of the day, what they've done is they've clarified some things, and it's not bad, but until it's official, there's no point in stressing out about it, if that makes sense. But they have released a new version, but it's a draft version right now. They just went through the comment period, and it should get published fairly shortly. But again, we're not going to spend a ton of detail on that, because at the end of the day, like, whether the controls get clarified or not, you still need to know how to run a program and what matters.
And what interval do they usually update, these, whether it's CMMC, I know that that's kind of ongoing until the dust settles from that. 800, 171, 853. Is there a regular update period on those?
So not necessarily. It does get updated. They're continuing to try to clarify things, because like what happens is they push something out, the government industrial complex pushes back and goes, wait, this doesn't make any sense. An example would be some of the FIPS compliance requirements. Some of the issues with that is the fact that you have to use a FIPS validated like version on your firewall or something like that, which can be potentially create a less secure option, because you're not able to take the latest updates, because you have to stay on that compliant version. So you're always a few versions behind. So that's an example of why like it's pushed back, but yeah.
Understood.
And then CUI here, we talked about that. So here's the components, right? So like it's 853 light. Yeah. So CUI, again, controlled unclassified information. So think of it as like, you might have names, but if you put like names and locations, you start putting stuff together, it becomes classified. So it's something that needs to be controlled to make sure that it's protected, because it's almost like the government's version of internal use only, if you will, or for official use only, FOUO.
Gotcha.
And 800, the components, very similar. Should look familiar if you're familiar with 853. All the spaces built into 14 families. Yep. And here's the concerns, right? So documentation, right? So some of the issue is I have customers in the old version, they have an appendix E. There's a lot of assumed things, and making sure you have the policies and procedures. You have to write some of this stuff down, because how do you audit how you're meeting that control, right? You want to make sure that you have policies and procedures that cover those things. And then some of the concerns I've come across is, what can we automate? What's acceptable, right? Like every business is different. And so being able to navigate that can be a challenge, right? So one of the things that's interesting is that you don't have to be perfect on your SPRS scores. There's a lot of assumptions out there that people think they have to turn in a perfect score. You don't. And in fact, you might be creating yourself a bigger liability by putting out, if you gave yourself a perfect score, but you're not actually really as tight as you are attesting to, now you're lying, which could create a bigger issue, as opposed to saying, hey, I'm not perfect, but here's my plan of action and milestones, or you'll hear a POAM. Having that POAM in place gives you time to continue to get to that point, but you don't have to be perfect when you're submitting those scores. And these are the challenges we come across, right? Is like people trying to be perfect, controls, like what can they automate, what's acceptable, who can they use, right? And then change is hard. So sometimes you have to hold people's hands while they change their password for the first time, right? And I think it's important when you're rolling out any program is to have that information campaign to make sure everyone understands what we're doing and why, so that the rules make sense. And the way I describe, especially if I'm working with DoD customers, a lot of them are prior government, military. So the rules are commensurate with the data classification, right? So we all know like there's rules for unclassified information, there's rules for how you handle secret information, and then there's even more rules for how you handle top secret information. And that's kind of how you want to roll stuff out so people understand what's going on.
I like the idea of that kind of information campaign internally, get buy-in, communicate change management really to the organization. Any change that is significant, but especially, if an organization's not prior military experience and is dealing with manufacturing or something that is in supply chain for Department of Defense, and they're being required to meet 800 171 compliance, and are not familiar with anything, that kind of internal marketing is super valuable, to get everybody on board and help them understand really what they are responsible for.
Absolutely, especially if you're, a DoD shop, that you're buying your laptops from Best Buy, you have Macs and you have Windows, and like you have no endpoint control because you've been kind of doing Lord of the Flies. Like there's changes, right? And you have to get ahead of that, and talk to people, make sure they understand like no one is trying to stop you from doing your job. The goal is to get to yes, which is to figure out how to do it.
Yep.
Cool.
So next slide.
So hurdles, changes, there may be some technical changes, like if you're using, depending on the SaaS applications that you're using, where you're storing that data, may have to change, depending on what you're using, what software you're using, because a lot of times you'll have people that are, let's say you're in O365 government edition, right? But some of your people are using Evernote, right? Nothing wrong with Evernote, but Evernote, especially if they're using a personal version and they're storing CUI or things like that in there, are important. And one thing let me take a step back here. One thing I forgot to talk about is people worry about CUI. The government needs to tell you what CUI is. So when you're like, do I have CUI? Do I not? It'll be in a contract. They have to tell you what it is. It's not something for you to decide this is CUI. Your customer is going to tell you what is CUI, so that to make it a little bit easier, so you're not trying to boil the ocean and be like, oh, this could be this. It's like a lot of it could be let your customer tell you what is. And yeah, so technical things, how do you isolate stuff, making sure that people have the need to know and the access to things. So that's sometimes a change too, like if you've who's got access, and then documenting stuff like with compliance, like if you can't prove it, it didn't happen. So figuring out how to get credit for running your program is always an adventure. So there's GRC tools out there for that. There's also but you can do a lot of stuff without buying more software. It's just creating a ticket. But one of the things we talked about in the previous webinar, and I'll reiterate this, the audit record is not your inbox. I'll say that again. The audit record is not your inbox. That's a terrible place to try to keep track or where you want to keep your evidence of you performing certain tasks. And then, yeah, analysis paralysis. People will over-engineer something or under-engineer it. Like, bring in help, get somebody to help you navigate that stuff in some way.
Yep. And regarding documentation, you mentioned that there are GRC tools out there, but they're not exactly needed. The important thing is just to store that somewhere that is kind of methodical, and that you have a way to track everything, and to actually store it not in your email box. What are kind of common places that people are storing their documentation that you're seeing?
That's a good question. So for their policies and procedures, store them in SharePoint, they might store them in a GRC tool, and that's not a big deal because that's not CUI, right? So
Yep.
the artifacts can be collected in a bunch of different ways. Like you can to prove you're following a process, you could use Trello boards, you could use Atlassian, like there's some IT ticketing system that you have will work very well. And one thing I would say is like when any of these magical tools come out there, remember your policies and procedures need to reflect what you actually do, not
Mhm.
if you take a bunch of documents off the internet and do find and replace, you're potentially opening yourself up to a massive liability, because what they're going to look at is, what does your policy and procedure say? What do you do? Right. And, you know, that's kind of, it can be quite a challenge for people. One thing that's, it's useful that I tell people too is, there is, at least for the old version, there's a set of auditing, guidelines that are already
Mhm.
published, and leveraging that, if you're questioning what to do on a control, you can look at that auditing guidance and go, hey, what does this say? Like, how are they going to audit it? Well, this is what they're going to look at. And the first thing they're going to look at in a lot of these things is, do they have a policy and procedure? Cool. What does it say? Boom. And then validate that, it's effective. But screenshots are fine. Video recording yourself, whatever you got to do.
Gotcha. All right, next slide.
And the journey, right? So the first part is figuring out how does CUI come into your environment. So once you know what CUI is, right, now we've got to figure out, where is it going? So are you storing it in share files on a desktop? Or is it emailed back and forth? What does it look like? Is it printed, right? And we're talking about CUI, but a lot of customers who have CUI, especially in the DIB space, also have ITAR. So you should be looking at kind of potentially combining those two programs. And that's where, that's why, I found Semper Sec is we're good at managing multiple standards, figuring out how to manage one program with the rules being appropriate to what's going on. So making sure, because you can have CUI and not necessarily have an issue with Canadian IT people or something like that.
Mhm.
But you will have an issue if you have ITAR.
Right.
You've got to work through, what are the rules, what makes sense. And this is where it's kind of this nice picture of just showing, where does it actually exist.
And in previous projects that I've done, this has actually kind of been the hardest thing for us to get a handle on. From the Airiam side, a lot of times we're focusing on access control and other IT and security controls, but basically setting the right permissions and the right, protecting that CUI, and so that it's in the right place and only the right people are able to view it and it's being able to use at the right times. But kind of following that CUI when we're coming into a client, especially when we don't understand their business processes from the beginning, and kind of trying to trace that flow of that information through their system. This email gets printed out, then the printout, it gets run down to the production floor and stapled on a wall, and then that kind of thing. Like, to understand really where this information is going within the organization.
And the way to do this too is to actually interview the different business processes. So if you're in the IT and security side, make no assumptions. You have to
Mhm.
talk to the business about what they're doing, and talk to sometimes their people, because you would be amazed at what management thinks is happening versus what's actually happening. Because people and most and you know you have to have that mentality as you're going on to talk about the IO campaign. Hey, we're trying to discover this stuff to figure it out. It's not who shot John. Let's not get people in trouble. Let's figure out what we're doing. Okay, let's fix this. Right? Don't be because people are generally trying to just do their job.
Mhm.
That's why they're storing it someplace, and you got to talk to them about it and work through that issue. Yeah,
All right,
next
next
slide.
slide.
And this is just a different diagram of a way to look at stuff. Like, how I like to do it sometimes is, like, if I know what CUI is, okay, what processes are involved with that, right? And then I talk to those process owners. Okay, what are the assets? What do we call these things that could contain the CUI that's created that we know about? And then where are we storing them? Like, how does it flow? So you kind of have that overall diagram of knowing, like, where's your CUI space. All right, dibs. So, yeah, again, this is not legal advice. We're going to talk about ITAR a little bit. I'm not a ITAR lawyer, but ITAR is the one compliance that will put you into, you can go to jail as opposed to just getting a fine. so it does matter. So we'll talk a little bit about this. So export controls, like if you're in the DIB space, you might be dealing with this. So making sure you understand ITAR. And for those of you not familiar with it, basically it was originally designed so that you weren't, if you built a cool weapon system, hey, you can't sell it outside the US, or you can sell it, but you can't sell it to these countries who you're not allowed to export to. And having those things documented, it doesn't mean that data can't leave the US. It just needs to be protected in accordance with ITAR regulations or the CUI regulations, if that makes sense. So CFR 48, chapter 1, and then chapter 2. This is basically requiring you to follow NIST 800-171 and attest to it. Okay, so that's why it applies whether CMMC gets approved or not. If you're doing work in the DoD space, it does apply, and you would probably already know that by now because you're filling out SPRS, but testing your system. Next. So here we go. This kind of gives you overall the what things you need to know. Basic safeguarding, the Cohen Act, what are the requirements, and the assurance program. So this is just kind of giving you the standards. So when people wonder, like, why do I have to do this, or do I have to do this? Here's why you have to do this. And that nobody's making this stuff up. There are more fun things to do than the 171, I'm sure. And then CMMC. So this is still, like, they think it might roll out by 2024. But there's nothing stopping you from getting this stuff in place, because when it does hit, you'll need to start complying with it pretty quickly. You'll have time, but if you're in the DoD space, you already need to be doing this. And so NIST 800-171 is that baseline. And that's the good part, is by doing NIST 800-171, whatever CMMC turns into, you will be at least 90% of the way there. So I don't know. I don't want to read all these slides here, but you definitely want to make sure that you're being honest on your plan of action and milestones. And that's one of the changes they're making with CMMC, is they're realizing, like, you don't have to have a perfect score. There are certain spaces where, like, if you're building a skiff or a data center or something like that, you would need to have a perfect score, but most of the time it's better to err on the side of caution of saying, hey, I'm not perfect. Here's what I'm working on, and here's my plan of action and milestones, right?
As you're going through this, how much of it is applying to your supply chain and your contractors that are working for you?
Great question.
Obviously, people that are required to have kind of DFARS 800-171 compliance, they're in the Department of Defense supply chain. But if they're if they're bringing in subcontractors, if they have suppliers, how much are they responsible for the compliance of their suppliers as well?
They are. So they're attesting to that. That flow down
Mhm,
is quite a thing. And so that's where people need help
mhm,
making sure that, like, not only are you doing what you say you do, but are your contractors doing what they say they're doing, right? And they may not all have CUI, but they may have federal contractor information, things like
mhm.
that. And so making sure that, like, you have to not only have your program, but you need to be validating that your third parties are doing things. And this slide right here is just talking about how to get in there and figure it out. So do an assessment, build that plan of action and milestones, and start fixing stuff, right? We can keep going here.
All right. So what's next? We have, thank you everybody for coming to this webinar and to the one yesterday. Obviously, Semper Sec is a close partner of ours, and And we really appreciate everything that they're helping us do on the compliance side. While Airiam loves to geek out on all the security tooling and the security controls and IT controls, Airiam really needs the support of SemperSec to get the documentation and the program actually stood up, and to work with you to do that consulting piece. So we work together really well. In the future here, we have some other webinars that are with some other partners. We have some threat actors webinars that are really talking about the incident response lifecycle with Evidin, with Mox 5, and with Threat Locker.
Yeah. And and we love working with Airiam. Like, one of the things that's important is using companies like Airiam to help augment your team. So the security incident response piece, right? Figuring that piece out. Continuous red teaming, vulnerability management, like using somebody who can go in, like they don't have to have access to CUI to patch a system. So making sure that like you're doing those things, and outsourcing the things that, like, yes, you can do. It's just like when people hire Semper Sec, there's nothing I'm doing. I'm a dumb Marine. Like, there is nothing I'm doing that's rocket science. It's more, do you have time to do it? Or the only time you have is between 2 and 4 in the morning. And are you going to be as good at it? It's going to be as efficient, or putting yourself in a position where you're actually running the program and having, especially if you're a smaller shop, using expert services to get you to manage that is a piece I would recommend. Something that I screwed up the first time. The other thing too is you can do your own gap assessment all day long, right? Having a third party say the same thing you've been saying, but that consultant says it, all of a sudden they're brilliant because it's a consultant. It's stupid, it is what it is. But not being afraid to leverage that, especially if you're new to an organization, like that's a huge that way you get to be the solutions person and not the negative Nancy. That
Yep.
way you can have your own IO campaign. If you're the problem solver, these consultants that come in and tell me my problems, like, they're disposable.
Right. Right. Exactly. Yeah, definitely use third-party consulting to uh, help you get budget for the right solutions when you need to too. So like Rob said, you may be saying the same thing the consultant's saying, but they're listening to the consultant. Yeah, go ahead and use that.
Yeah. Well, I think we talked about it other webinar is when you're looking at consultants too, if you're watching this and you're Boeing, like, yeah, you go get a consultant that's used to working at a 30,000 person organization. But if you're not a 30,000 person organization or 100,000 person organization, you need to make sure you're looking at consultants that know how to write a program that's appropriate for your size. Because sometimes that requires some creative compliance because you're not that big. And it's also finding people that aren't trying to sell you all the things.
Mhm.
Like, because there are tools out there that'll help with CUI. But at the end of the day, if your processes aren't down and you don't know exactly what's going on, you're just trying to make, you'll be shoehorning a process into a piece of technology as opposed to the other way around.
Yep, exactly. And then I think right sizing all your service providers beyond the compliance program is important too. If you're bringing in an MSSP or an MSP like Airiam to help you with some of that remediation work, make sure that they're someone that can handle your industry, someone that can handle your size, and your needs. We're not all the same. So we all have sweet spots of where we're good. So definitely interview and work with those service providers.
Cool.
All
Any
right. Yeah,
questions?
we also have two other webinars coming up, one on July 26th and one on August 3rd. The July 26th one is about AI, and that's going to be really fun. We're going to try not to get all Terminator end of the world on you, but it might go there. Because it's just kind of reality, the existential risk of AI. But we're going to talk about really the risks, operational risks with AI, as well as some of the pros of AI. And we have a cyber resilience webinar with Under Defense, which is an amazing MDR company out of Europe. Really started in Ukraine, and those guys have been defending against Russia for the last over a year here in consistent attacks, and so they've learned a lot and can share a lot with us. All right, next slide. All right, let's see what questions we have here. Awesome. So yeah, somebody asked if we would convert slides to PDF to post. We will be sharing these videos as well as the slides for for public distros so that everybody can see. Any other questions? Anybody have anything
Play stump and
curious
chop.
about?
Got a question
Yep.
on a specific control? No, everyone knows what they're doing. What's an acceptable score? So there's no specific acceptable score. But I think was the top score is like 114, I think. You probably don't want to turn in a 3, but well, all I'm saying is that you don't need to be perfect. Like there's a lot of points you can get by just having good people and process.
Mhm.
And if you haven't solved one specific issue, it's not as big of a deal, right? But I don't want to say what's going to be 100% acceptable, but like, because if you turn in a 3, like again, like that's going to be an issue. Are the same. So no, yes and no. So 853 is what 171 is based on. So yeah, the question is 171 and 853 the same? 853 is like the Godfather standard. It has all the controls. 171 is a subset of those controls that are tailored for people handling controlled and classified information. Because like when you use 853, think of that when you hear FedRAMP. If you're doing SaaS products, like they take 853 and add some additional guidance for that for software as a service customers, right? So this is tailored. You're not handling nuclear codes, but maybe you're handling data that tells us, that the people who are handling it. Like you might have that information. Maybe that's CUI. I don't know. Semper Sec help you get my business compliant. Yes. So what Semper Sec does, that's a great question. So one of the questions is, does Semper Sec help my business get compliant? Yeah. So we craft your policies so you can just be interviewed. You can spend time following the process or implementing technical controls. We will craft the policies, be your guiding light, help you deal with your customers, and work through those different challenges, right? Of like, how do I solve this? Is this implementation correct? But like I said, sitting there as your battle buddy, helping you maintain your plan of action and milestones. And I say help, like either we're doing it for you, or we're there as your battle buddy, depending on what role you want us to take.
And one thing I will say is that I've worked with several people on Semper Sec's team now. They're all very experienced in going through this. They are subject material experts in these compliances, the interpretations of the controls, everything that they have a process down for getting this done. So it's not, you don't feel like you're flinging solutions against the wall. They actually can help you with a method to get this done.
Because we don't sell software. Like if we're recommending something, you should probably do it. If you don't, that's fine. Like I'm not trying to push product down your throat. Because I firmly believe that product is only as good as the people and process behind it, or you just bought shelfware.
Yep. Now, one kind of, on the technical side with controls, kind of one question I always have is how verbatim the controls need to be interpreted. And for instance, needing segmentation between networks that contain CUI and not non-CUI. Let's say you have a 5-person company where everyone's touching CUI, and like, and you have one server, it's a small business, everything is, you're really going to have one segment, but you know accomplishing, how to accomplish segmentation when you're dealing with a super small scale like that in order to satisfy the control. So really, I worked, and then we created a guest network that would not have access to CUI, things
Network.
like that, and now I have a segmented network. Yeah, so it's a but yeah, so there are some controls there that need some kind of interpretation, some help that Semper Sec can help you solve those problems.
Yeah, and that's the creative compliance, right? If like, because there's times where like, you don't, let's say you're a completely SaaS-based company, like you're a coffee shop model, you don't have an internal network at
Mhm.
all. Like, how do you deal with that, right? Like there's times where like they might say this doesn't apply, but you have to have the right justification.
Mhm.
I mean, and don't get me wrong, there's times where I've thought about just like hooking up two Western Digital drives next to each other and going like, yep, now I have an internal network. Now I've
Yep.
segmented it. Just
Yep.
like, but it's challenging, right? Like figuring out what do I do if this isn't really a thing.
Yep.
That's totally true.
All right. Okay, so with no more questions, let's move on to the next slide, which is really how to get a hold of us. And so there's info for SemperSec and info for Airiam here. Feel free to reach out if you have any compliance questions or needs. And with Airiam, any kind of technical remediation, IT control help, um, getting technology in place. Also very strong at migration work, and any kind of a real IT support in addition to the security side. So, you know, two very strong companies that work really well together. Give us a ring. Thank you everybody for coming to our webinar, and thank you, Rob. Thank you, SemperSec, for helping make this happen.
No, it's an honor to be here, and we're very excited. And yeah, it's great. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Bye.